Hi, it's Nicole. It's the end of July. A lot of us have been reading books by Jane Austen or about Jane Austen. I completed 4 out of the 7 challenges of Jane Austen July. I also watched some marvelous shows this month. I'll talk about those in a separate video. Let's get the non-Jane Austen July books out of the way first. I read Still Like an Artist by Austen Kleon, partly because I liked his show your work, partly because I want to see if the author uses Shakespeare as an example. I mentioned it in a previous video. It is a motivating little non-fiction book that's part of a series. It's Austen Kleon's autobiographical tips and advice for anyone doing creative work. Even before I finished it, I already started thinking about side projects to do alone and with friends. It's all rather exciting. One thing to bear in mind is not only about stealing artfully. Most of the book is on general tips about doing creative work. Whispers Underground is the 3rd book in the Rivers of London series by Ben Aaronovitch. This time, withered apprentice police constable Peter Grant from London Metropolitan Police has to deal with a murder in the London Underground that leads to, among many things, an impressive and hilarious police chase in the vast and revolting London sewage system. I mentioned before that the combination of magic and an urban setting is quite unique and refreshing for a fantasy series. Another feature is emerging as now I come to book 3. Sympathy and concern for the abnormal or the minority people group. Last time it was the jazz vampires, this time the quiet people in the underground settlement. The easiest way to solve the problem is to get rid of them. They are so unlike us, and there will be no legal consequence. They don't exist on paper, but Peter Grant thinks differently. He doesn't behave like an hero. He's mostly quite clueless and useless, but he makes a difference for the vulnerable and voiceless, and that makes him quite a different type of hero. Now, things that I read for Jane Austen July. I completed 4 out of 7 challenges with a theatre twist to the challenges. Challenge 1 is to read one of Jane Austen's main 6 novels. As planned, I read Mansfield Park. I chose it because the characters put on a play in the novel and the casting of the play is significant to the storyline of the novel. The play is called Lovers' Vows, which I also read this month. I will talk about it a bit later. I wasn't a big fan of Fanny Price when I read Mansfield Park last time, but I know a lot of you love Fanny, so I thought I'd read it again and see what I missed seeing in her that you clearly saw. In my opinion, she's Jane Austen's most gentle, modest, blameless and correct heroine. She's always considerate, she's never selfish, she's always thinking of how to cause the least trouble for others, how to draw the least attention to herself, and how to take up the least space. But that also means she hardly ever speaks unless spoken to. She's an observer of all the drama going on. She's more like us, the readers, than the protagonist of the novel. This comes across especially clearly in the scene when the young people take a walk in Mr. Rushworth's ground. She just sits there and watches people coming on and off stage almost. And when they rehearse for Lovers' Vows. When Edmund was clearly disillusioned about Mary Crawford, Fanny doesn't directly challenge him. She waits and watches and hopes for the best. She's so gentle and so unlike any other heroines. She almost doesn't feel like a protagonist from Jane Austen's pen. If you think of all the heroines, Emma, Eleanor and Marian, Lizzie Bennet, Catherine Morland and Anne Elliot, they are a lot more spirited than Fanny, and Anne is probably the most like her. But interestingly, though Fanny is not my favorite, Anne is. There are a lot of similarities between Fanny and Anne, starting from the fact that both of them are a bit of an outsider to the family they live with. One of the biggest differences, though, is that Anne takes charge and has a quiet confidence that Fanny has yet to develop. I guess Anne could be an older and more mature version of Fanny. Among the rest of the characters, Henry Crawford grabbed my attention. He starts off as a playboy that lives to flirt and break women's hearts, and I see his change over the novel. His private conversation with his sister Mary is like the asides in Shakespeare's plays. When he speaks to his sister, we know he's speaking from the heart. So I believe his affection and appreciation for Fanny was genuine. "Yes, Mary," said he, drawing her arm within his and walking along the sweep as if not knowing where he was. "I could not get away sooner. Fanny looked so lovely. I am quite determined, Mary. My mind is entirely made up. Will it astonish you? No, you must be aware that I am quite determined to marry Fanny Price." The surprise was now complete, for, in spite of whatever his consciousness might suggest, a suspicion of his having any such views had never entered his sister's imagination, and she looked so truly the astonishment she felt that he was obliged to repeat what he had said, and more fully and more solemnly. The conviction of his determination once admitted, it was not unwelcome. There was even pleasure with the surprise. Mary was in a state of mind to rejoice in a connection with the Bertram family, and to be not displeased with her brothers marrying a little beneath him. "Yes, Mary," was Henry's concluding assurance. "I am fairly caught. You know with what idle designs I began, but this is the end of them. I have, I flatter myself, made no inconsiderable progress in her affections, but my own are entirely fixed." So what happened at the end of the novel was entirely unexpected, but Fanny got what she wanted, so I'm happy for her. Challenge 2 is to read something by Jane Austen that is not one of her main 6 novels. I read The History of England from the reign of Henry IV to the death of Charles I by a partial, prejudiced, and ignorant historian. The History of England was written when Jane Austen was 15. It was illustrated with coloured portraits by her sister Cassandra. I am gutted that I didn't buy the little booklet from the Jane Austen Centre in Bath when I visited last time, but I found the second best thing for you. You can read the entire text and see the images of Jane Austen's original notebook with her handwriting and Cassandra's drawings in the British Library online gallery. I'll put the link in the description box. It's overall delightful and very funny. This is her account of the first monarch. Henry IV ascended the throne of England, much to his own satisfaction, in the year 1399, after having prevailed on his cousin and predecessor Richard II to resign it to him, and to retire for the rest of his life to Pomfret Castle, where he happened to be murdered. It is to be supposed that Henry was married, since he had certainly 4 sons, but it is not in my power to inform the reader who was his wife. But this as he may, he did not live forever, but falling ill, his son, the Prince of Wales, came and took away the crown, whereupon the king made a long speech, for which I must refer the reader to Shakespeare's plays, and the prince made a still longer. Things being thus settled between them, the king died. She seems to have a very clear and strong opinion about the monarchs, especially Mary, Queen of Scots. My principal reason for undertaking the history of England being to prove the innocence of the Queen of Scotland, which I flatter myself with having effectually done, and to abuse Elizabeth, though I'm rather fearful of having fallen short in the latter part of my scheme. I'm not sure she has fallen short in abusing Queen Elizabeth I. She's absolutely brutal. Jane Austen calls her that disgrace to humanity, that pest of society, Elizabeth. Challenge 3 is to read a non-fiction work about Jane Austen or her time. The Genius of Jane Austen by Paula Byrne is definitely the main course on this month's menu. It's a non-fiction book about the influence of drama and theatre on Jane Austen and her works. Part 1 is about the input, what the popular plays, subject matters and trends were, who the famous actors were at the time, and what Jane Austen watched, and how she absorbed plays and theatre since she was young. Part 2 is about the output, how her writing styles and stories were influenced. It includes Chapter 4, early works, where the influences are explicit and direct. Chapter 5, from play to novel, talks about how Jane Austen experimented with plays and epistolary novels herself, but moved on from them. Then there is a chapter each on 4 of her main novels: Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, and Emma. It concludes with why she is a hit in Hollywood. I just finished reading chapter 8, which is on lovers' vows and the complex relationship between the characters in lovers' vows and the characters in Mansfield Park. It's super interesting and it makes me admire Jane Austen more. The novels are so much cleverer than they look on the surface level if you dig into them. Challenge 5 is to read a book by a contemporary of Jane Austen. I read The Blue Jar Storybook, which is a collection of children's stories by various authors who lived around the same time as Jane Austen. The Blue Jar Storybook includes The Blue Jar and The Basket Woman by Maria Edgeworth. Both are moral lessons for children. The Blue Jar is a brutal lesson about ignorance, disobedience, vanity, and the disastrous result of the three combined. Or you can see the Blue Jar as a young girl's love for beauty smothered by her practical and unsympathetic parents who have not a shred of romantic notion. The Basket Woman is an unrealistic lesson that good conduct will be rewarded, therefore be good. However, The Sea Voyage by Charles Lamb and The Changeling by Mary Lamb are worthy of your time. The Sea Voyage by Charles Lamb is a story of a 6-year-old girl from an aristocratic background who boards a ship without any female attendants and spends her journey across the sea with a crew of unpolished but kind sailors. Among them, one young man takes special care of her, watches the sea and the sky, whales and dolphins with her, tells her stories and calms her fears. I heard a lot about Charles Lamb and know him as a gentle soul who went through great sorrow and suffering in life. This lovely little story crystallizes his sweet gentleness and quiet sorrow into sparkling beauty. When in foul weather, I have been terrified at the motion of the vessel as he rocked backwards and forwards. He would still my fears and tell me that I used to be rocked so once in a cradle, and that the sea was God's bed and the ship our cradle, and we were as safe in that great motion as when we felt that lesser one in our little wooden sleeping places. When the wind was up and sung through the sails and disturbed me with his violent clamours, he would call it music and bid me hark to the sea organ, and with that name he quieted my tender apprehensions. The ending is very sad. Charles Lamb narrates tragedy in a shockingly matter-of-fact voice. It's a stamp-sized sketch of a person, but an excellent story nonetheless. The Changeling by Mary Lamb is about the switching of two baby girls, one an heiress, one a nobody. The astonishing thing is that the story is narrated in first person by the fake heiress, and more astonishingly, like in Mansfield Park, she puts on a play that echoes reality and reveals her true identity. Why would you do that? There are 2 more stories in the collection that I didn't read. You can find the Blue Jar storybook on Gutenberg website. I'll put the link in the description box for you. Under Challenge 5, I also read Lover's Vows by Elizabeth Inchbald, the play that's made famous and immortal by Jane Austen in Mansfield Park. I feel like every copy of Mansfield Park should have Lover's Vows as an appendix. It's definitely one of the best surprises this month. Lover's Vows starts with a woman, Agatha, who was poor, starving and sick, got thrown out of a countryside inn. She was too proud and embarrassed to beg, but a young soldier walking past had pity on her. Lo and behold, it was her son. Frederick had been a soldier abroad and learned for the first time that his mother was seduced and abandoned by a wealthy man when she was young and pregnant. He left his mother in the care of a kind couple and went to beg for money while coming across the Baron. In desperation, Frederick threatened the Baron with his sword and he was locked up. The Baron had a daughter who was a spirited young woman trying to sort out her romantic relationship. This daughter, Amelia, was played by Mary Crawford in Mansfield Park, and the man whom Amelia loved, a clergyman called Anne Holt, was played by Edmund Bertram. Now I understand why Fanny Price was in such fascination and heartache rehearsing this scene with both of them. By the way, I can totally imagine Edmund playing Anne Holt. At the end of the day, Lover's Vows is a moral lesson about good and evil, repentance and forgiveness, but it's not preachy. It feels natural, authentic and endearing. It's much better on a whole different level if you compare it to The Blue Jar or The Basket Woman. The play is short and sweet. I finished it in one sitting. It's a lot easier to read and more interesting than I expected. I thought all plays are hard work like Shakespeare. Clearly not. I'll be very happy to read more plays from Jane Austen's time. For the rest of the challenges, I didn't watch any screen adaptation or modern retelling. I might watch some in August since I'm carrying on with books from Jane Austen July for a bit longer anyway. It would be nice to watch some films after reading The Genius of Jane Austen with all the new things I learned. As usual, my planning for Jane Austen July was too ambitious. I didn't have time to read more from What Matters in Jane Austen. Lady Disdain reads recommended reading A Note on Jane Austen by C.S. Lewis and Jane Austen and the Moralists by Gilbert Ryle side by side. I didn't have time for either. I might carry on with Jane Austen July into August and finish reading all of this. I want to rewatch the film version of Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice and Persuasion. I definitely will continue reading The Genius of Jane Austen in August as well. Lastly, on a completely different note, I shared that I've been struggling with metamorphosis ever since March. Here's my solution. I bought a brand new translation of Metamorphosis yesterday and look how beautiful it is. I'm so excited to read it all over again. Shall I go back to the beginning or shall I start where I am? What would you do? That's all for today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in my next one.